This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 17. Weave we the woof, the thread is spun, the web is wove, the work is done. Gray. The hostile armies which lay in the wilds of the Horican passed the night of the 9th of August, 1757, much in the manner they would had they encountered on the fairest field of Europe. While the conquered were still, sullen, and dejected, the victors triumphed. But there are limits alike to grief and joy, and long before the watches of the morning came, the stillness of those boundless woods was only broken by a gay call from some exulting young Frenchman of the advanced pickets, or a menacing challenge from the fort, which sternly forbade the approach of any hostile footsteps before the stipulated moment. Even these occasional threatening sounds ceased to be heard in that dull hour which precedes the day, at which period a listener might have sought in vain any evidence of the presence of those armed powers that then slumbered on the shores of the Holy Lake. It was during these moments of deep silence that the canvas which concealed the entrance to a spacious marquee in the French encampment was shoved aside, and a man issued from beneath the drapery into the open air. He was enveloped in a cloak which might have been intended as a protection from the chilling damps of the woods, but which served equally well as a mantle to conceal his person. He was permitted to pass the grenadier who watched over the slumbers of the French commander, without interruption, the man making the usual salute which betokens military deference, as the other passed swiftly through the little city of tents in the direction of William Henry. Whenever this unknown individual encountered one of the numberless sentinels who crossed his path, his answer was prompt, and, as it appeared, satisfactory, for he was uniformly allowed to proceed without further interrogation. With the exception of such repeated but brief interruptions, he had moved silently from the centre of the camp to its most advanced outposts, when he drew nigh the soldier who held his watch nearest to the works of the enemy. As he approached he was received with the usual challenge. "Qui vive?" "France," was the reply. "Le mot d'ordre?" "La victoire," said the other, drawing so nigh as to be heard in a loud whisper. "C'est bien," returned the sentinel, throwing his musket from the charge to his shoulder. "Vous vous promenez bien matin, monsieur." "Il est nécessaire d'être vigilant, mon enfant," the other observed, dropping a fold of his cloak, and looking the soldier close in the face as he passed him, still continuing his way towards the British fortification. The man started, his arms rattled heavily as he threw them forward in the lowest and most respectful salute, and when he had again recovered his peace, he turned to walk his post, muttering between his teeth, "Il faut être vigilant en vérité. Je crois que nous avons là un caporal qui ne dort jamais." The officer proceeded, without affecting to hear the words which escaped the sentinel in his surprise, nor did he again pause until he had reached the low strand, and in a somewhat dangerous vicinity to the western water bastion of the fort. The light of an obscured moon was just sufficient to render objects, though dim, perceptible in their outlines. He therefore took the precaution to place himself against the trunk of a tree, where he leant for many minutes, and seemed to contemplate the dark and silent mounds of the English works in profound attention. His gaze at the ramparts was not that of a curious or idle spectator, but his looks wandered from point to point, denoting his knowledge of military usages, and betraying that his search was not unaccompanied by distrust. At length he appeared satisfied, and having cast his eyes impatiently upward towards the summit of the eastern mountain, as if anticipating the approach of the morning, he was in the act of turning on his footsteps, when a light sound on the nearest angle of the bastion caught his ear and induced him to remain. Just then a figure was seen to approach the edge of the rampart, where it stood, apparently contemplating in its turn the distant tents of the French encampment. Its head was then turned towards the east, as though equally anxious for the appearance of light, when the form leant against the mound, and seemed to gaze upon the glassy expanse of the waters, which, like a submarine firmament, glittered with its thousand mimic stars. The melancholy air, the hour, together with the vast frame of the man who thus leant, in musing, against the English ramparts, left no doubt as to his person in the mind of the observant spectator. Delicacy, no less than prudence, now urged him to retire, and he had moved cautiously round the body of the tree for that purpose, when another sound drew his attention, and once more arrested his footsteps. It was a low and almost inaudible movement of the water, and was succeeded by a grating of pebbles one against the other. In a moment he saw a dark form rise, as it were, out of the lake, and steal, without further noise, to the land, within a few feet of the place where he himself stood. A rifle next slowly rose between his eyes and the watery mirror, but before it could be discharged, his own hand was on the lock. "Ah!" exclaimed the savage, whose treacherous aim was so singularly and so unexpectedly interrupted. Without making any reply, the French officer laid his hand on the shoulder of the Indian, and led him in profound silence to a distance from the spot where their subsequent dialogue might have proved dangerous, and where it seemed that one of them, at least, sought a victim. Then, throwing open his cloak, so as to expose his uniform and the cross of St. Louis, which was suspended at his breast, Montcalm sternly demanded: "What means this? Does not my son know that the hatchet is buried between the English and his Canadian father?" "What can the Hurons do?" returned the savage, speaking also, though imperfectly, in the French language. "Not a warrior has a scalp, and the pale faces make friends. Ah! le renard subtil! Methinks this is an excess of zeal for a friend who was so late an enemy. How many suns have set since Le Renard struck the war post of the English?" "Where is that sun?" demanded the sullen savage. "Behind the hill, and it is dark and cold. But when he comes again, it will be bright and warm. Le Subtil is the son of his tribe. There have been clouds and many mountains between him and his nation, but now he shines, and it is a clear sky." "That Le Renard has power with his people I well know," said Montcalm, "for yesterday he hunted for their scalps, and today they hear him at the council fire. Magua is a great chief. Let him prove it by teaching his nation how to conduct toward our new friends." "Why did the chief of the Canadas bring his young men into the woods and fire his cannon at the earthen house?" demanded the subtle Indian. "To subdue it. My master owns the land, and your father was ordered to drive off these English squatters. They have consented to go, and now he calls them enemies no longer. 'Tis well. Magua took the hatchet to color it with blood. It is now bright. When it is red, it shall be buried. But Magua is pledged not to sully the lilies of France. The enemies of the great king across the salt lake are his enemies, his friends, the friends of the Hurons." "Friends!" repeated the Indian in scorn. "Let his father give Magua a hand." Montcalm, who felt that his influence over the warlike tribes he had gathered was to be maintained by concession rather than by power, complied reluctantly with the other's request. The savage placed the finger of the French commander on a deep scar in his bosom, and then exultingly demanded: "Does my father know that? What warrior does not? 'Tis where a leaden bullet has cut. And this," continued the Indian, who had turned his naked back to the other, his body being without its usual calico mantle, "this? My son has been sadly injured here. Who has done this?" "Magua slept hard in the English wigwams, and the sticks have left their mark," returned the savage, with a hollow laugh, which did not conceal the fierce temper that nearly choked him. Then, recollecting himself, with sudden and native dignity, he added: "Go, teach your young men it is peace. Le Renard Subtil knows how to speak to a Huron warrior." Without deigning to bestow further words, or to wait for any answer, the savage cast his rifle into the hollow of his arm, and moved silently through the encampment towards the woods, where his own tribe was known to lie. Every few yards, as he proceeded, he was challenged by the sentinels, but he stalked sullenly onward, utterly disregarding the summons of the soldiers, who only spared his life because they knew the air and tread no less than the obstinate daring of an Indian. Montcalm lingered long and melancholy on the strand, where he had been left by his companion, brooding deeply on the temper which his ungovernable ally had just discovered. Already had his fair fame been tarnished by one horrid scene, and in circumstances fearfully resembling those under which he now found himself. As he mused, he became keenly sensible of the deep responsibility they assume who disregard the means to attain their end, and of all the danger of setting in motion an engine which it exceeds human power to control. Then, shaking off a train of reflections that he accounted a weakness in such a moment of triumph, he retraced his steps towards his tent, giving the order, as he passed, to make the signal that should arouse the army from its slumbers. The first tap of the French drums was echoed from the bosom of the fort, and presently the valley was filled with the strains of martial music, rising long, thrilling, and lively above the rattling accompaniment. The horns of the victors sounded merry and cheerful flourishes, until the last laggard of the camp was at his post; but the instant the British fifes had blown their shrill signal, they became mute. In the meantime the day had dawned, and when the line of the French army was ready to receive its general, the rays of a brilliant sun were glancing along the glittering array. Then that success, which was already so well known, was officially announced. The favored band who were selected to guard the gates of the fort were detailed, and defiled before their chief. The signal of their approach was given, and all the usual preparations for a change of masters were ordered and executed directly under the guns of the contested works. A very different scene presented itself within the lines of the Anglo-American army. As soon as the warning signal was given, it exhibited all the signs of a hurried and forced departure. The sullen soldiers shouldered their empty tubes, and fell into their places like men whose blood had been heated by the past contest, and who only desired the opportunity to revenge an indignity which was still wounding to their pride, concealed as it was under all the observances of military etiquette. Women and children ran from place to place, some bearing the scanty remnants of their baggage, and others searching in the ranks for those countenances they looked up to for protection. Munro appeared among his silent troops, firm but dejected. It was evident that the unexpected blow had struck deep into his heart, though he struggled to sustain his misfortune with the port of a man. Duncan was touched at the quiet and impressive exhibition of his grief. He had discharged his own duty, and he now pressed to the side of the old man to know in what particular he might serve him. "My daughters," was the brief but expressive reply. "Good heavens! are not arrangements already made for their convenience?" "To-day I am only a soldier, Major Heyward," said the veteran. "All that you see here claim alike to be my children." Duncan had heard enough. Without losing one of those moments which had now become so precious, he flew towards the quarters of Munro in quest of the sisters. He found them on the threshold of the low edifice, already prepared to depart, and surrounded by a clamorous and weeping assemblage of their own sex, that had gathered about the place with a sort of instinctive consciousness that it was the point most likely to be protected. Though the cheeks of Cora were pale, and her countenance anxious, she had lost none of her firmness; but the eyes of Alice were inflamed, and betrayed how long and bitterly she had wept. They both, however, received the young man with undisguised pleasure, the former, for a novelty, being the first to speak. "The fort is lost," she said, with a melancholy smile, "though our good name, I trust, remains. 'Tis brighter than ever. But, dearest Miss Munro, it is time to think less of others, and to make some provision for yourself. Military usage, pride, that pride on which you so much value yourself, demands that your father and I should, for a little while, continue with the troops. Then where to seek a proper protector for you against the confusion and chances of such a scene?" "None is necessary," returned Cora. "Who will dare to injure or insult the daughter of such a father at a time like this?" "I would not leave you alone," continued the youth, looking about him in a hurried manner, "for the command of the best regiment in the pay of the king. Remember, our Alice is not gifted with all your firmness, and God only knows the terror she might endure." "You may be right," Cora replied, smiling again, but far more sadly than before. "Listen! Chance has already sent us a friend when he is most needed." Duncan did listen, and on the instant comprehended her meaning. The low and serious sounds of the sacred music, so well known to the eastern provinces, caught his ear, and instantly drew him to an apartment in an adjacent building, which had already been deserted by its customary tenants. There he found David pouring out his pious feelings through the only medium in which he ever indulged. Duncan waited until, by the cessation of the movement of the hand, he believed the strain was ended, when, by touching his shoulder, he drew the attention of the other to himself, and in a few words explained his wishes. "Even so," replied the single-minded disciple of the King of Israel, when the young man had ended. "I have found much that is comely and melodious in the maidens, and it is fitting that we, who have consorted in so much peril, should abide together in peace. I will attend them when I have completed my morning praise, to which nothing is now wanting but the doxology. Wilt thou bear a part, friend? The metre is common, and the tune Southwell." Then, extending the little volume, and giving the pitch of the air anew, with considerate attention, David recommenced and finished his strains, with a fixedness of manner that it was not easy to interrupt. Heyward was fain to wait until the verse was ended, when, seeing David relieving himself from his spectacles, and replacing the book, he continued: "It will be your duty to see that none dare to approach the ladies with any rude intention, or to offer insult or taunt at the misfortune of their brave father. In this task you will be seconded by the domestics of their household." "Even so." "It is possible that the Indians and stragglers of the enemy may intrude, in which case you will remind them of the terms of the capitulation, and threaten to report their conduct to Montcalm. A word will suffice." "If not, I have that here which shall," returned David, exhibiting his book, with an air in which meekness and confidence were singularly blended. "Here are words which, uttered, or rather thundered, with proper emphasis, and in measured time, shall quiet the most unruly temper. Why rage the heathen furiously?" "Enough!" said Heyward, interrupting the burst of his musical invocation. "We understand each other. It is time that we should now assume our respective duties." Gamut cheerfully assented, and together they sought the females. Cora received her new and somewhat extraordinary protector courteously at least, and the pallid features of Alice lighted again with some of their native archness, as she thanked Heyward for his care. Duncan took occasion to assure them he had done the best that circumstances permitted, and, as he believed, quite enough for the security of their feelings. Of danger there was none. He then spoke gladly of his intention to rejoin them the moment he had led the advance a few miles toward the Hudson, and immediately took his leave. By this time the signal of departure had been given, and the head of the English column was in motion. The sisters started at the sound, and glancing their eyes around, they saw the white uniforms of the French grenadiers, who had already taken possession of the gates of the fort. At that moment an enormous cloud seemed to pass suddenly above their heads, and looking upwards, they discovered that they stood beneath the wide folds of the standard of France. "Let us go," said Cora. "This is no longer a fit place for the children of an English officer." Alice clung to the arm of her sister, and together they left the parade, accompanied by the moving throng that surrounded them. As they passed the gates, the French officers, who had learned their rank, bowed often and low, forbearing, however, to intrude those attentions which they saw, with peculiar tact, might not be agreeable. As every vehicle and each beast of burden was occupied by the sick and wounded, Cora had decided to endure the fatigues of a foot march rather than interfere with their comforts. Indeed, many a maimed and feeble soldier was compelled to drag his exhausted limbs in the rear of the columns, for the want of the necessary means of conveyance in that wilderness. The whole, however, was in motion, the weak and wounded groaning and in suffering, their comrades silent and sullen, and the women and children in terror, they knew not of what. As the confused and timid throng left the protecting mounds of the fort and issued on the open plain, the whole scene was at once presented to their eyes. At a little distance on the right, and somewhat in the rear, the French army stood to their arms, Montcalm having collected his parties so soon as his guards had possession of the works. They were attentive but silent observers of the proceedings of the vanquished, failing in none of the stipulated military honors, and offering no taunt or insult in their success to their less fortunate foes. Living masses of the English, to the amount in the whole of near 3,000, were moving slowly across the plain towards the common center, and gradually approached each other as they converged to the point of their march, a vista cut through the lofty trees where the road to the Hudson entered the forest. Along the sweeping borders of the woods hung a dark cloud of savages, eyeing the passage of their enemies, and hovering at a distance like vultures who were only kept from stooping on their prey by the presence and restraint of a superior army. A few had straggled among the conquered columns, where they stalked in sullen discontent, attentive, though as yet passive, observers of the moving multitude. The advance, with Heyward at its head, had already reached the defile, and was slowly disappearing, when the attention of Cora was drawn to a collection of stragglers by the sounds of contention. A truant provincial was paying the forfeit of his disobedience by being plundered of those very effects which had caused him to desert his place in the ranks. The man was of powerful frame, and too avaricious to part with his goods without a struggle. Individuals from either party interfered, the one side to prevent, and the other to aid, in the robbery. Voices grew loud and angry, and 100 savages appeared, as it were by magic, where a dozen only had been seen a minute before. It was then that Cora saw the form of Magua gliding among his countrymen, and speaking with his fatal and artful eloquence. The mass of women and children stopped, and hovered together like alarmed and fluttering birds. But the cupidity of the Indian was soon gratified, and the different bodies again moved slowly onwards. The savages now fell back, and seemed content to let their enemies advance without further molestation. But as the female crowd approached them, the gaudy colors of a shawl attracted the eyes of a wild and untutored Huron. He advanced to seize it without the least hesitation. The woman, more in terror than through love of the ornament, wrapped her child in the coveted article, and folded both more closely to her bosom. Cora was in the act of speaking, with an intent to advise the woman to abandon the trifle, when the savage relinquished his hold of the shawl, and tore the screaming infant from her arms. Abandoning everything to the greedy grasp of those around her, the mother darted, with distraction in her mien, to reclaim her child. The Indian smiled grimly, and extended one hand in sign of a willingness to exchange, while with the other he flourished the babe above his head, holding it by the feet, as if to enhance the value of the ransom. "Here, here, there, all, any, everything!" exclaimed the breathless woman, tearing the lighter articles of dress from her person with ill-directed and trembling fingers. "Take all, but give me my babe!" The savage spurned the worthless rags, and perceiving that the shawl had already become a prize to another, his bantering but sullen smile changing to a gleam of ferocity, he dashed the head of the infant against a rock, and cast its quivering remains to her very feet. For an instant the mother stood like a statue of despair, looking wildly down at the unseemly object which had so lately nestled in her bosom and smiled in her face, and then she raised her eyes and countenance towards heaven, as if calling on God to curse the perpetrator of the foul deed. she was spared the sin of such a prayer, for, maddened at his disappointment, and excited by the sight of blood, the Huron mercifully drove his tomahawk into her own brain. The mother sank under the blow, and fell, grasping at her child in death with the same engrossing love that had caused her to cherish it when living. At that dangerous moment Magua placed his hands to his mouth and raised the fatal and appalling whoop. The scattered Indians started at the well-known cry, as coursers bound at the signal to quit the goal, and directly there arose such a yell along the plain and through the arches of the wood as seldom burst from human lips before. They who heard it listened with a curdling horror at the heart, little inferior to that dread which may be expected to attend the blasts of the final summons. More than 2,000 raging savages broke from the forest at the signal, and threw themselves across the fatal plain with instinctive alacrity. We shall not dwell on the revolting horrors that succeeded. Death was everywhere, and in his most terrific and disgusting aspects. Resistance only served to inflame the murderers, who inflicted their furious blows long after their victims were beyond the power of their resentment. The flow of blood might be likened to the outbreaking of a torrent, and as the natives became heated and maddened by the sight, many among them even knelt to the earth and drank freely, exultingly, hellishly, of the crimson tide. The trained bodies of the troops threw themselves quickly into solid masses, endeavoring to awe their assailants by the imposing appearance of a military front. The experiment in some measure succeeded, though far too many suffered their unloaded muskets to be torn from their hands in the vain hope of appeasing the savages. In such a scene none had leisure to note the fleeting moments. It might have been 10 minutes, it seemed an age, that the sisters had stood riveted to one spot, horror-stricken and nearly helpless. When the first blow was struck, their screaming companions had pressed upon them in a body, rendering flight impossible, and now that fear or death had scattered most, if not all, from around them, they saw no avenue open but such as conducted to the tomahawks of their foes. On every side arose shrieks, groans, exhortations, and curses. At this moment Alice caught a glimpse of the vast form of her father, moving rapidly across the plain in the direction of the French army. He was, in truth, proceeding to Montcalm, fearless of every danger, to claim the tardy escort for which he had before conditioned. 50 glittering axes and barbed spears were offered unheeded at his life, but the savages respected his rank and calmness, even in their fury. The dangerous weapons were brushed aside by the still nervous arm of the veteran, or fell off themselves, after menacing an act that it would seem no one had courage to perform. Fortunately, the vindictive Magua was searching for his victim in the very band the veteran had just quitted. "Father, father, we are here!" shrieked Alice, as he passed, at no great distance, without appearing to heed them. "Come to us, father, or we die!" The cry was repeated, and in terms and tones that might have melted a heart of stone, but it was unanswered. Once, indeed, the old man appeared to catch the sounds, for he paused and listened, but Alice had dropped senseless on the earth, and Cora had sunk at her side, hovering in untiring tenderness over her lifeless form. Munro shook his head in disappointment, and proceeded, bent on the high duty of his station. "Lady," said Gamut, who, helpless and useless as he was, had not yet dreamt of deserting his trust, "it is the jubilee of the devils, and this is not a meet place for Christians to tarry in. Let us up and fly." "Go," said Cora, still gazing at her unconscious sister. "Save thyself. To me thou canst not be of further use." David comprehended the unyielding character of her resolution by the simple but expressive gesture that accompanied her words. He gazed for a moment at the dusky forms that were acting their hellish rites on every side of him, and his tall person grew more erect, while his chest heaved and every feature swelled, and seemed to speak with the power of the feelings by which he was governed. If the Jewish boy might tame the evil spirit of Saul by the sound of his harp and the words of sacred song, it may not be amiss, he said, to try the potency of music here. Then, raising his voice to its highest tones, he poured out a strain so powerful as to be heard even amid the din of that bloody field. More than one savage rushed towards them, thinking to rifle the unprotected sisters of their attire and bear away their scalps; but when they found this strange and unmoved figure riveted to his post, they paused to listen. Astonishment soon changed to admiration, and they passed on to other and less courageous victims, openly expressing their satisfaction at the firmness with which the white warrior sang his death song. Encouraged and deluded by his success, David exerted all his powers to extend what he believed so holy an influence. The unwonted sounds caught the ears of a distant savage, who flew raging from group to group, like one who, scorning to touch the vulgar herd, hunted for some victim more worthy of his renown. It was Magua, who uttered a yell of pleasure when he beheld his ancient prisoners again at his mercy. "Come," he said, laying his soiled hand on the dress of Cora, "the wigwam of the Huron is still open. Is it not better than this place?" "Away!" cried Cora, veiling her eyes from his revolting aspect. The Indian laughed tauntingly as he held up his reeking hand, and answered, "It is red, but it comes from white veins. Monster, there is blood, oceans of blood, upon thy soul; thy spirit has moved this scene." "Magua is a great chief," returned the exulting savage. "Will the dark hair go to his tribe?" "Never! Strike if thou wilt, and complete thy revenge." He hesitated a moment, and then, catching the light and senseless form of Alice in his arms, the subtle Indian moved swiftly across the plain toward the woods. "Hold!" shrieked Cora, following wildly on his footsteps. "Release the child! Wretch! What is it you do?" But Magua was deaf to her voice, or rather he knew his power, and was determined to maintain it. "Stay, lady, stay!" called Gamut, after the unconscious Cora. "The holy charm is beginning to be felt, and soon shalt thou see this horrid tumult stilled." Perceiving that in his turn he was unheeded, the faithful David followed the distracted sister, raising his voice again in sacred song, and sweeping the air to the measure with his long arm in diligent accompaniment. In this manner they traversed the plain, through the flying, the wounded, and the dead. The fierce Huron was at any time sufficient for himself and the victim that he bore, though Cora would have fallen more than once under the blows of her savage enemies, but for the extraordinary being who stalked in her rear, and who now appeared to the astonished natives gifted with a protecting spirit of madness. Magua, who knew how to avoid the more pressing dangers, and also to elude pursuit, entered the woods through a low ravine, where he quickly found the Narragansetts, which the travelers had abandoned so shortly before, awaiting his appearance in custody of a savage as fierce and as malign in his expression as himself. Laying Alice on one of the horses, he made a sign for Cora to mount the other. Notwithstanding the horror excited by the presence of her captor, there was a present relief in escaping from the bloody scene enacting on the plain, to which Cora could not be altogether insensible. She took her seat, and held forth her arms for her sister with an air of entreaty and love that even the Huron could not deny. Placing Alice, then, on the same animal with Cora, he seized the bridle, and commenced his route by plunging deeper into the forest. David, perceiving he was left alone, utterly disregarded, as a subject too worthless even to destroy, threw his long limb across the saddle of the beast they had deserted, and made such progress in the pursuit as the difficulties of the path permitted. They soon began to ascend, but as the motion had tendency to revive the dormant faculties of her sister, the attention of Cora was too much divided between the tenderest solicitude in her behalf, and in listening to the cries, which were still too audible on the plain, to note the direction in which they journeyed. When, however, they gained the flattened surface of the mountain top, and approached the eastern precipice, she recognized the spot to which she had once before been led under the more friendly auspices of the scout. Here Magua suffered them to dismount, and notwithstanding their own captivity, The curiosity, which seems inseparable from horror, induced them to gaze at the sickening sight below. The cruel work was still unchecked. On every side the captured were flying before their relentless persecutors, while the armed columns of the Christian king stood fast in an apathy which has never been explained, and which has left an immovable blot on the otherwise fair escutcheon of their leader. Nor was the sword of death stayed until cupidity got the mastery of revenge. Then indeed the shrieks of the wounded and the yells of their murderers grew less frequent, until finally the cries of horror were lost to their ear, or were drowned in the loud, long, and piercing whoops of the triumphant savages. Note: the accounts of the number who fell in this unhappy affair vary between 5 and 1,500. End of chapter 17.
Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eric Wisdahl, Gainesville, Florida. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 18.
Why anything? An honorable murder, if you will, for naught I did in hate, but all in honor. Othello.
The bloody and inhuman scene rather incidentally mentioned than described in the preceding chapter is conspicuous in the pages of colonial history by the merited title of The Massacre of William Henry. It so far deepened the stain which a previous and very similar event had left upon the reputation of the French commander that it was not entirely erased by his early and glorious death. It is now becoming obscured by time, and thousands who know that Montcalm died like a hero on the plains of Abraham have yet to learn how much he was deficient in that moral courage without which no man can be truly great. Pages might yet be written to prove, from his illustrious example, the defects of human excellence, to show how easy it is for generous sentiments, high courtesy, and chivalrous courage to lose their influence beneath the chilling blight of selfishness, and to exhibit to the world a man who was great in all the minor attributes of character, but who was found wanting when it became necessary to prove how much principle is superior to policy. But the task would exceed our prerogatives, and, as history, like love, is so apt to surround her heroes with an atmosphere of imaginary brightness, it is probable that Louis de Saint Véran will be viewed by posterity only as the gallant defender of his country, while his cruel apathies on the shore of the Oswego and of the Huron will be forgotten. Deeply regretting this weakness on the part of a sister muse, we shall at once retire from her sacred precincts within the proper limits of our own humble vocation. The third day from the capture of the fort was drawing to a close, but the business of the narrative must still detain the reader on the shores of the Holy Lake. When last seen, the environs of the work were filled with violence and uproar. They were now possessed by stillness and death. The blood-stained conquerors had departed, and their camp, which had so lately rung with the merry rejoicings of a victorious army, lay a silent and deserted city of huts. The fortress was a smoldering ruin. Charred rafters, fragments of exploded artillery, and rent mason-work covered its earthen mounds in confused disorder. A frightful change had also occurred in the season. The sun had hid its warmth behind an impenetrable mass of vapor, and hundreds of human forms, which had blackened beneath the fierce heat of August, were stiffening in their deformity before the blasts of a premature November. The curling and spotless mist, which had been seen sailing above the hills towards the north, were now returning in an interminable dusky sheet that was urged along by the fury of a tempest. The crowded mirror of the hurricane was gone, and, in its place, the green and angry waters lashed the shores, as if indignantly casting back its impurities to the polluted strand. Still the clear fountain retained a portion of its charmed influence, but it reflected only the somber gloom that fell from the impending heavens. That humid and congenial atmosphere which commonly adorned the view, veiling its harshness and softening its asperities, had disappeared. The northern air poured across the waste of waters so harsh and unmingled that nothing was left to be conjectured by the eye, or fashioned by fancy. The fiercer element had cropped the verdure of the plain, which looked as though it were scathed by the consuming lightning, but here and there a dark green tuft rose in the midst of the desolation, the earliest fruits of a soil that had been fattened with human blood. The whole landscape, which, seen by a favoring light, and in a genial temperature, had been found so lovely, appeared now like some pictured allegory of life, in which objects were arrayed in their harshest but truest colors, and without the relief of any shadowing. The solitary and arid blades of grass arose from the passing gusts fearfully perceptible. The bold and rocky mountains were too distinct in their barrenness, and the eye even sought relief, in vain, by attempting to pierce the illimitable void of heaven, which was shut to its gaze by the dusky sheet of ragged and driving vapor. The wind blew unequally, sometimes sweeping heavily along the ground, seeming to whisper its moanings in the cold ears of the dead, then rising in a shrill and mournful whistling. It entered the forest with a rush that filled the air with the leaves and branches it scattered in its path. Amid the unnatural shower, a few hungry ravens struggled with the gale, but no sooner was the green ocean of woods which stretched beneath them past than they gladly stopped, at random, to their hideous banquet. In short, it was a scene of wildness and desolation, and it appeared as if all who had profanely entered it had been stricken, at a blow, by the relentless arm of death. But the prohibition had ceased, and for the first time since the preparators of those foul deeds which had assisted to disfigure the scene were gone, living human beings had now presumed to approach the place. About an hour before the setting of the sun, on the day already mentioned, the forms of 5 men might have been seen issuing from the narrow vista of trees, where the path to the Hudson entered the forest, and advancing in the direction of the ruined works. At first their progress was slow and guarded, as though they entered with reluctance amid the horrors of the post, or dreaded the renewal of its frightened insolence. A light figure preceded the rest of the party, with the caution and activity of a native, ascending every hillock to reconnoitre, and indicating by gestures to his companions the route he deemed it most prudent to pursue. Nor were those in the rear wanting in every caution and foresight known to forest warfare. One among them, he alone was an Indian, moved a little on one flank and watched the margin of the woods, with eyes long accustomed to read the smallest sign of danger. The remaining 3 were white, though clad in vestments adapted, both in quality and color, to their present hazardous pursuit, that of hanging on the skirts of a retiring army in the wilderness. The effects produced by the appalling sights that constantly arose in their path to the lake shore were as different as the characters of the respective individuals who composed the party. The youth in front threw serious but furtive glances at the mangled victims as he stepped lightly across the plain, afraid to exhibit his feelings, and yet too inexperienced to quell entirely their sudden and powerful influence. His red associate, however, was superior to such weakness. He passed the groups of dead with a steadiness of purpose and an eye so calm that nothing but long and inveterate practice could enable him to maintain. The sensations produced in the minds of even the white men were different, though uniformly sorrowful. One, whose gray locks and furrowed lineaments blended with a martial air and tread, betrayed, in spite of the disguise of woodman's dress, a man long experienced in scenes of war, was not ashamed to groan aloud whenever a spectacle of more than usual horror came under his view. The young man at his elbow shuddered, but seemed to suppress his feelings in tenderness to his companion. Of them all, the straggler who brought up the rear appeared alone to betray his real thoughts, without fear of observation or dread of consequences. He gazed at the most appalling sight with eyes and muscles that knew not how to waver, but with execrations so bitter and deep as to denote how much he denounced the crime of his enemies. The reader will perceive at once, in these respective characters, the Mohicans and their white friend the scout, together with Munro and Heyward. It was, in truth, the father in quest of his children, attended by the youth who felt so deep a stake in their happiness, and those brave and trustworthy foresters, who had already proved their skill and fidelity through the trying scenes related. When Uncas, who moved in the front, had reached the center of the plain, he raised a cry that drew his companions in a body to the spot. The young warrior had halted over a group of females who lay in a cluster, a confused mass of dead. Notwithstanding the revolting horror of the exhibition, Munro and Heyward flew towards the festering heap, endeavoring, with a love that no unseemliness could extinguish, to discover whether any vestiges of those they sought were to be seen among the tattered and many-colored garments. The father and the lover found instant relief in the search, though each was condemned again to experience the misery of an uncertainty that was hardly less insupportable than the most revolting truth. They were standing, silent and thoughtful, around the melancholy pile when the scout approached. Eyeing the sad spectacle with an angry countenance, the sturdy woodsman, for the first time since his entering the plain, spoke intelligibly and aloud.
"I've been on many a shocking field, and have followed a trail of blood for weary miles," he said, "but never have I found the hand of the devil so plain as it is here to be seen. Revenge is an Indian feeling, and all who know me know that there is no cross in my veins. But this much will I say, here, in the face of heaven, and with the power of the Lord so manifest in this howling wilderness, that should these Frenchers ever trust themselves again within the range of a ragged bullet, there is one rifle which shall play its part so long as flint will fire or powder burn. I leave the tomahawk and knife to such as have a natural gift to use them. What say you, Chingachgook?" he added, in Delaware. "Shall the Hurons boast of this to their women when the deep snows come?"
A gleam of resentment flashed across the dark lineaments of the Mohican chief. He loosened his knife in its sheath, and then, turning calmly from the sight, his countenance settled into a repose as deep as if he knew the instigation of passion. Montcalm," continued the deeply resentful and less self-restrained scout. "They say a time must come when all the deeds done in the flesh will be seen at a single look, and that by eyes cleared from mortal infirmities. Woe betide that wretch who is born to behold this plain, with the judgment hanging about his soul. Ha! As I am a man of white blood, yonder lies a redskin, without the hair of his head where nature rooted it. Look to him, Delaware. It may be one of your missing people, and he should have burial like a stout warrior. I see it in your eyes, Sagamore. A Huron pays for this, for the fall winds have blown away the scent of the blood." Chingachgook approached the mutilated form, and, turning it over, he found the distinguishing marks of one of those 6 allied tribes, or nations, as they were called, who, while they fought in the English ranks, were so deadly hostile to his own people. Spurning the loathsome object with his foot, he turned from it with the same indifference he would have quitted a brute carcass. The scout comprehended the action, and very deliberately pursued his own way, continuing, however, his denunciations against the French commander in the same resentful strain. "Nothing but vast wisdom and unlimited power should dare to sweep off men in multitudes," he added, "for it is only that one that can know the necessity of the judgment. And what is there, short of the other, that can replace the creatures of the Lord? I hold it a sin to kill the second buck afore the first is eaten, unless a march in front, or an ambushment be contemplated. It is a different matter with a few warriors in open, rugged fight, for 'tis their gift to die with the rifle or the tomahawk in hand, accordingly as their natures may happen to be, white or red. Uncas, come this way, lad, and let the ravens settle upon the Mingo. I know, from often seeing it, that they have a craving for the flesh of an Oneida, and it is as well to let the bird follow the gift of its natural appetite." "Huh!" exclaimed the young Mohican, rising on the extremities of his feet, gazing intently in his front, frightening the ravens to some other prey by the sound and the action. "What is it, boy? whispered the scout, lowering his tall form into a crouching attitude, like a panther about to take his leap.
"I'd send it be a tardy Frencher skulking for plunder. I do believe Killdeer would take an uncommon range today."
Uncas, without making any reply, bounded away from the spot, and in the next instant he was seen tearing from a bush, and waving in triumph a fragment of the green riding veil of Cora. The movement, the exhibition, and the cry which again burst from the lips of the young Mohican instantly drew the whole party about him. "My child!" said Munro, speaking quickly and wildly. "Give me my child!"
"Uncas will try,"
was the short and touching answer. The simple but meaning assurance was lost on the father, who seized the piece of gauze and crushed it in his hand, while his eyes roamed fearfully among the bushes, as if he were equally dreaded and hoped for the secrets they might reveal. "Here are no dead," said Heyward. "The storm seems not to have passed this way."
"That's manifest, and cleared the heavens about our heads," returned the undisturbed scout. "But either she or they that have robbed her have passed the bush, for I remember the rag she wore to hide her face that all did love to look upon. Uncas, you are right. The dark-haired has been here, and she has fled like a frightened fawn to the wood. None who could fly would remain to be murdered. Let us search for the marks she left, for, to Indian eyes, I sometimes think a hunting-bird leaves his trail in the air."
The young Mohican darted away at the suggestion, and the scout had hardly done speaking before the former raised a cry of success from the margin of the forest. On reaching the spot, the anxious party perceived another portion of the veil fluttering on the lower branch of a beech.
"Softly, softly," said the scout, extending his long rifle in front of the eager Heyward. "We now know our work, but the beauty of the trail must not be deformed. A step too soon may give us hours of trouble. We have them, though. That much is beyond denial."
Bless ye, worthy man. Whither, then, have they fled, and where are my babes?"
"The path they have taken depends on many chances. If they have gone on alone, they are quite as likely to move in a circle as straight, and they may be within a dozen miles of us. But if the Hurons, or any of the French Indians, have laid hands on them, 'tis probably they are now near the borders of the Canadas. But what matters that?"
continued the deliberate scout, observing the powerful anxiety and the disappointment the listeners exhibited.
"Here are the Mohicans nigh on one end of the trail, and, rely on it, we find the other, though they should be 100 leagues asunder. Gently, gently, Uncas. You are as impatient as a man in the settlements. You forget that light feet leave but faint marks."
"Huh!" exclaimed Chingachgook, who had been occupied in examining an opening that had been evidently made through the low underbrush which skirted the forest, and who now stood erect, as he pointed downward, in the attitude and with the air of a man who beheld a disgusting serpent.
"Here is the palpable impression of the footsteps of a man," cried Heyward, bending over the indicated spot. "He is trod in the margin of this pool, and the mark cannot be mistaken. They are captives." "Better so than left to starve in the wilderness," returned the scout. "And they will leave a wider trail. I would wager 50 beaver skins against as many flints that the Mohicans and I enter their wigwams within the month. Stoop to it, Uncas, and try what you can make of the moccasin, for moccasin it plainly is, and no shoe."
The young Mohican bent over the track, and, removing the scattered leaves from around the place, he examined it with much of that sort of scrutiny that a money dealer, in these days of pecuniary doubts, would bestow on a suspected due-bill. At length he arose from his knees, satisfied with the result of the examination.
"Well, boy," demanded the attentive scout, "what does it say? Can you make anything of the telltale?" "Le renard subtil. Ah! That rampaging devil again. There will never be an end of his looping till Killdeer has said a friendly word to him.
Heyward reluctantly admitted the truth of this intelligence, and now expressed rather his hopes than his doubts by saying, "One moccasin is so much like another, it is probable there is some mistake."
"One moccasin like another! You may as well say that one foot is like another, though we all know that some are long and others short, some broad and others narrow, somewhat high and somewhat low in steps, some in-toed and some out. One moccasin is no more like another than one book is like another, though they who can read in one are seldom able to tell the marks of the other, which is all ordered from the best, giving to every man his natural advantages. Let me get down to it, Uncas. Neither book nor moccasin is the worse for having two opinions instead of one."
The scout stooped to the task, and instantly added,
"You're right, boy. Here's the patch we saw so often in the other chase, and the fellow will drink when he can get an opportunity. Your drinking Indian always learns to walk with a wider toe than the natural savage, it being the gift of a drunkard to straddle, whether of white or red skin. 'Tis just the length and breadth, too. Look at it, Sagamore. You measured the prints more than once, when we hunted the varmints from glens to the Hell Springs."
Chingachgook complied, and after finishing his short examination, he arose, and with a quiet demeanor, he merely pronounced the word
"Magua." "'Tis a settled thing. Here, then, have passed the dark hair and Magua."
"And not Alice?" demanded Heyward.
"Of her we have not yet seen the signs,"
reported the scout, looking closely around at the trees, the bushes, and the ground.
"What have we there? Uncas, bring hither the thing you see dangling from yonder thorn bush."
When the Indian had complied, the scout received the prize, and, holding it on high, he laughed in a silent but heartfelt manner.
"'Tis the tooting weapon of the singer. Now we shall have a trail a priest might travel," he said. "Uncas, look for the marks of a shoe that is long enough to uphold 6 feet 2 of tottering human flesh. I begin to have some hopes of the fellow, since he has given up squalling to follow some better trade."
"At least he has been faithful to his trust," said Heyward, "and Cora and Alice are not without a friend."
"Yes,"
said Hawkeye, dropping his rifle and leaning on it with an air of visible contempt.
"He will do their singing. Can he slay a buck for their dinner, journey by the moss on the beaches, or cut the throat of a Huron? If not, the first catbird he meets is the cleverer of the two. Well, boy, any signs of such a foundation?"
Footnote: the powers of the American mockingbird are generally known, but the true mockingbird is not found so far north as the state of New York, where it has, however, two substitutes of inferior excellence, the catbird, so often named by the scout, and the bird vulgarly called ground thresher. Either of these last two birds is superior to the nightingale or the lark, though in general the American birds are less musical than those of Europe. End footnote.
"Here is something like the footsteps of one who has worn a shoe. Can it be that of our friend?"
"Touch the leaves lightly, or you'll disconcert the formation. That is the print of a foot, but 'tis the dark hairs, and small it is, too, for one of such noble height and grand appearance. The singer would cover it with his heel."
"Where? Let me look at the footsteps of my child," said Munro, shoving the bushes aside and bending fondly over the nearly obliterated impression. Though the tread which had left the mark had been light and rapid, it was still plainly visible. The aged soldier examined it with eyes that grew dim as he gazed, nor did he rise from this stooping posture until Heyward saw that he had watered the trace of his daughter's passage with a scalding tear. Willing to divert a distress which threatened each moment to break through to restraint of appearances, by giving the veteran something to do, the young man said to the scout,
"As we now possess these infallible signs, let us commence our march. A moment at such a time will appear an age to the captives." "It is not the swiftest leaping deer that gives the longest chase," returned Hawkeye, without moving his eyes from the different marks that had come under his view. "We know that the rampaging Huron had passed, the dark-haired, and the singer. But where is she of the yellow locks and blue eyes? Though little, and far from being as bold as her sister, she is fair to the view, and pleasant in discourse. Has she no friend, that none care for her? God forbid she should ever want hundreds. Are we not now in her pursuit? For one, I will never cease the search till she be found. In that case we may have to journey by different paths, for here she is not passed, light and little as her footsteps would be.
Heyward drew back, all his ardor to proceed seeming to vanish on that instant. Without attending to the sudden change in the other's humor, the scout, after musing a moment, continued,
There is no woman in this wilderness could leave such a print as that. But the dark-haired are his sister. We know that the first had been here, but where are the signs of the other? Let us push deeper on the trail, and if nothing offers, we must go back to the plain and strike another scent. Move on, Junkers. Keep your eyes on the dried leaves. I will watch the bushes while your father shall run with a low nose to the ground. Move on, friends. The sun is getting behind the hills.
"Is there nothing that I can do?" demanded the anxious Heyward.
"You?"
repeated the scouts, who, with his red friends, was already advancing in the order he had prescribed.
"Yes. You can keep in our rear, and be careful not to cross the trail."
Before they had proceeded many rods, the Indians stopped, and appeared to gaze at some signs on the earth with more than their usual keenness. Both father and son spoke quickly and loud, now looking at the object of their mutual admiration, and now regarding each other with the most unequivocal pleasure.
"They have found the Littlefoot!"
exclaimed the scout, moving forward without attending further to his own portion of the duty.
"What have we here? An ambushment has been planted in the spot. No, by the truest rifle on the frontiers, here have been them one-sided horses again. Now the whole secret is out, and all is plain as the North Star at midnight. Yes, here they have mounted. There the beasts have been bound to a sapling and waiting, and yonder runs the broad path away to the north, in full sweep for the Canadas."
"But still there are no signs of Alice, of the younger Miss Monroe," said Duncan.
"Unless the shining bauble Uncas has just lifted from the ground should prove one. Pass it this way, lad, that we may look at it."
Heyward instantly knew it for a trinket that Alice was fond of wearing, and which he recollected, with the tenacious memory of a lover, to have seen on the fatal morning of the massacre, dangling from the fair neck of his mistress. He seized the highly prized jewel, and, as he proclaimed the fact, it vanished from the eyes of the wandering scout, who in vain looked for it on the ground, long after it was warmly pressed against the beating heart of Duncan.
"Pshaw!"
said the disappointed Hawkeye, ceasing to rake the leaves with the breech of his rifle.
"'Tis a certain sign of age, when the sight begins to weaken. Such a glittering gewgaw not to be seen. Well, well, I can squint along a clouded barrel yet. That is enough to settle all disputes between me and the Mingos. I should like to find the thing, too, if it were only to carry it to the right owner. That would be bringing the two ends of what I call a long trail together, for by this time the broad St. Lawrence, or perhaps the Great Lakes themselves, are between us."
"So much the more reason why we should not delay our march," returned Heyward. "Let us proceed."
"Young blood and hot blood, they say, are much the same thing. We are not about to start on a squirrel hunt, or to drive a deer into the Horican, but to outlie for days and nights, and to stretch across a wilderness where the feet of men seldom go, and where no bookish knowledge would carry you through harmless. An Indian never starts on such an expedition without smoking over his council fire, and, though a man of white blood, I honor their customs in this particular, seeing that they are deliberate and wise. We will, therefore, go back and light our fire tonight in the ruins of the old fort, and in the morning we shall be fresh and ready to undertake our work like men, and not like babbling women or eager boys."
Heyward saw, by the manner of the scout, that altercation would be useless. Monroe had again sunk into the sort of apathy which had beset him since his late overwhelming misfortunes, and from which he was apparently to be roused only by some new and powerful excitement. Making a merit of necessity, the young man took the veteran by the arm, and followed in the footsteps of the Indians and the scout, who had already begun to retrace the path which conducted them to the plain. End of chapter 18.
A LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barbara Pfaff of Perryville, Missouri. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 19. Sailor, why, I am sure, if he forfeit, thou wilt not take his flesh. What's that good for? Shy, to bait fish withal? If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. Merchant of Venice. The shades of evening had come to increase the dreariness of the place, when the party entered the ruins of William Henry. The scout and his companions immediately made their preparations to pass the night there, but with an earnestness and sobriety of demeanor that betrayed how much the unusual horrors they had just witnessed worked on even their practiced feelings. A few fragments of rafters were reared against the blackened wall. When Uncas had covered them slightly with brush, the temporary accommodations were deemed sufficient. The young Indian pointed toward his rude hut when his labor was ended, and when Heyward, who understood the meaning of the silent gesture, gently urged Munro to enter. Leaving the bereaved old man alone with his sorrows, Duncan immediately returned to the open air, too much excited himself to seek the repose he had recommended to his veteran friend. While Hawkeye and the Indians lighted their fire and took their evening's repast, a frugal meal of dried bear's meat, the young man paid a visit to that curtain of the dilapidated fort which looked out on the sheet of the Hurricane. The wind had fallen, and the waves were already rolling on the sandy beach beneath him, in a more regular and tempered succession. The clouds, as if tired of their furious chase, were breaking asunder, the heavier volumes gathering in black masses about the horizon, while the lighter scud still hurried above the water, or eddied among the tops of the mountains, like the broken flights of birds hovering around their roosts. Here and there a red fiery star struggled through the drifting vapor, furnishing a lurid gleam of brightness to the dull aspects of the heavens. Within the bosom of the encircling hills an impenetrable darkness had already settled, and the plain lay like a vast and deserted charnel house, without omen or whisper to disturb the slumbers of its numerous and hapless tenants. Of this scene, so chillingly in accordance with the past, Duncan stood for many minutes a rapt observer, his eyes wandering from the bosom of the mound where the Fosters were seated around their glimmering fire to the fainter light which still lingered in the skies, and then rested long and anxiously on the embodied gloom, which lay like a dreary void on the side of him which were the dead reposed. He soon fancied that inexplicable sounds arose from the place, thoughts so indistinct and stolen as to render not only their nature but even their existence uncertain. Ashamed of his apprehensions, the young man turned towards the water, and strove to divert his attention to the mimic stars that dimly glimmered on its moving surface. Still his too conscious ears performed their ungrateful duty, as if to warn him of some lurking danger. At length a swift trampling seemed quite audible to rush athwart the darkness. Unable any longer to quiet his uneasiness, Duncan spoke in a low voice to the scout, requesting him to ascend the mound to the place where he stood. Hawkeye threw his rifle across an arm and complied, but with an air so unmoved and calm as to prove how much he counted on the security of their position. "Listen," said Duncan, when the other placed himself deliberately at his elbow. "There are suppressed noises on the plain which may show Montcalm has not yet entirely deserted his conquest." "Then ears are better than eyes," said the undisturbed scout, who, having just deposited a portion of bear between his grinders, spoke thick and slow, like one whose mouth was doubly occupied. "I myself saw him caged in tie, and with all his host, for your Frenchers, when they have done a clever thing, like to get back, and have a dance or a merrymaking with the women over their success? I know not. An Indian seldom sleeps in war, and plunder may keep a Huron hereafter his tribe has departed. It would be well to extinguish the fire and have a watch. Listen! You hear the noise I mean? An Indian more rarely lurks about graves, though ready to slay, and not over regardful of the means. He is commonly content with the scalps, unless when blood is hot and temper up, but after spirit is once fairly gone, he forgets his enmity, and is willing to let the dead find their natural rest. Speaking of spirits, Major, are you of the opinion that heaven of the redskins and of us whites will be one and the same? No doubt, no doubt. I thought I heard it again. Or was it the rustle of the leaves in the top of the beech? For my own part, continued Hawkeye, turning his face for a moment in the direction indicated by Heyward, but with a vacant and careless manner, I believe that paradise is ordained for happiness, and that men will be indulged in it according to their dispositions and gifts. I, therefore, judge that a redskin is not far from the truth when he believes he is to find them glorious hunting grounds of which his tradition tells. Nor, for that matter, do I think it would be any disparagement to a man without a cross to pass his time. You hear it again? Interrupted Duncan. Aye, aye, when food is scarce, and when food is plenty, a wolf grows bold, said the unmoved scout. There would be picking, too, among the skins of the devils, if there was light and time for the sport. But concerning the life that is to come, Major, I've heard preachers say in the settlements that heaven was a place of rest. Now men's minds differ as to their ideas of enjoyment. For myself, I say it with reverence to the ordering of Providence. It would be no great indulgence to be kept shut up in those mansions of which they preach, having a natural longing for motion and chase. Duncan, who was now made to understand the nature of the noise he had heard, answered with more attention to the subject which the humor of the scout had chosen for discussion by saying, "It is difficult to account for the feelings that may attend to the last great change." "It would be a change indeed for a man who has passed his days in the open air," returned the single-minded scout, "and who has often broken his fast on the headwaters of the Hudson, to sleep with sound of the roaring Mohawk. But it is a comfort to know we serve a merciful master, though we do it each after his fashion, and with great tracts of wilderness atween us. What goes there? Is it not the rushing wolves you have mentioned?" Hawkeye slowly shook his head, and beckoned for Duncan to follow him to a spot which the glare from the fire did not extend. When he had taken this precaution, the scout placed himself in an attitude of intense attention, and listened long and keenly for a repetition of the low sound that had so unexpectedly startled him. His vigilance, however, seemed exercised in vain, for after a fruitless pause he whispered to Duncan, "We must give call to Uncas. The boy has Indian senses. He may hear what is hid from us, for, being white-skinned, I will not deny my nature." The young Mohican, who was in conversation in a low voice with his father, started as he heard the moaning of an owl, and springing to his feet, he looked toward the black mounds, as if seeking the place whence the sounds proceeded. The scout repeated the call, and in a few moments Duncan saw the figure of Uncas stealing cautiously along the rampart to the spot where they stood. Hawkeye explained his wishes in a very few words, which were spoken in the Delaware tongue. So soon as Uncas was in possession of the reason why he was summoned, he threw himself flat on the turf, where, to the eyes of Duncan, he appeared to lie quiet and motionless. Surprised at the immovable attitude of the young warrior, and curious to observe the manner in which he employed his faculties to attain the desired information, Heyward advanced a few steps, and bent over the dark object on which he kept his eyes riveted. Then it was he discovered that the form of Uncas vanished, and that he beheld only the dark outline of an inequality in the embankment. "What has become of the Mohican?" he demanded of the scout, stepping back in amazement. "It was here that I saw him fall, and could have sworn that here he yet remained." "Hist! Speak lower, for we know not what ears are open. The Mingoes are quick-witted breed. As for Uncas, he is out on the plain, and the Maquas, if any such are about, will find their equal." "You think that Montcalm has not called off all his Indians? Let us give the alarm to our companions, that we may stand at arms. Here are 5 of us, who are not unused to meet an enemy. Not a word to either, as you value your life. Look at Sagamore, how like a grand Indian chief he sits by the fire. If there are any skulkers out in the darkness, they will never discover by his countenance that we suspect danger at hand. But they may discover him, and it will prove his death. His person can be too plainly seen by the light of the fire, and he will become the first and the most certain victim. It is undeniable that now you speak the truth, returned the scout, betraying more anxiety than was usual. Yet what can be done? A single suspicious look might bring on an attack before we are ready to receive it. He knows, by the call I gave to Uncas, that we have struck a scent. I will tell him that we are on the trail of the Mingos. His Indian nature will teach him how to act. The scout applied his fingers to his mouth, and raised a low hissing sound that caused Duncan at first to start aside, believing he had heard a serpent. The head of Chingachgook was resting on a hand, and he sat musing by himself, but the moment he heard the warning of an animal whose name he bore, he arose to an upright position, and his dark eyes glanced swiftly and keenly on every side of him. When his sudden and perhaps involuntary movement, every appearance of surprise or alarm ended. His rifle lay untouched, and apparently unnoticed, within the reach of his hand. The tomahawk that he had loosened in his belt for the sake of ease was even suffered to fall from its usual situation to the ground, and his form seemed to sink, like that of a man whose nerves and sinews were suffered to relax for the purpose of rest. Cunningly resuming his former position, though with the change of hand, as if the movement had been made merely to relieve the limb, the native awaited the result with a calmness and fortitude that none but an Indian warrior would have known how to exercise. But Heyward saw that while a less instructed eye, the Mohican chief appeared to slumber. His nostrils were expanded. His head was turned a little to one side, as if to assist the organ of hearing, and that his quick and rapid glances ran incessantly over every object within the power of his vision. "See the noble fellow," whispered Hawkeye, pressing the arm of Heyward. "He knows that a look or emotion might disconcert our schemes, and put us at the mercy of them imps." He was interrupted by a flash and report of a rifle. The air was filled with sparks of fire around the spot where the eyes of Heyward were still fastened with admiration and wonder. A second look told him that Chingachgook had disappeared in the confusion. In the meantime, the scout had thrown forward his rifle, like one prepared for service, and awaited impatiently the moment when an enemy might rise to view. But with the solitary and fruitless attempt made on the life of Chingachgook, the attack appeared to have terminated. Once or twice the listeners thought they could distinguish the distant rustling of bushes, and bodies of some unknown description rushed through them. Nor was it long before Hawkeye pointed out that the scampering of wolves, as they fled precipitately before the passage of some intruder on their proper domains, after an impatient and breathless pause, a plunge was heard in the water. It was immediately followed by the report of another rifle. "There goes Uncas," said the scout. "The boy bears a smart piece. I know its crack, as well as a father knows the language of his child, for I carried the gun myself until a better offered." "What can this mean?" demanded Duncan. "We are watched, and, as it would seem, marked for destruction. Yonder scattered band can witness that no good was intended, and that this Indian will testify that no harm has been done," returned the scout, dropping his rifle across his arm again, and following Chingachgook, who just then reappeared within the circle of light, into the bosom of the work. "How is it, Sagamore? Are the Mingos upon us in earnest, or is it only one of those reptiles who hang upon the skirts of a war party, to scalp the dead and go in, and make their boast among the squaws of the valiant deeds done on the pale-faces?" Chingachgook very quietly resumed his seat, nor did he make a reply, until after he had examined the firebrand which had been struck by the bullet that nearly proved fatal to himself, after which he was content to reply, holding a finger up to view with the English monosyllable, "One." "I thought as much," returned Hawkeye, seating himself, "and as he had got to the cover of the lake before Uncas pulled upon him, it is more probable the knave will sing his lies with some great ambushment, in which he was outlying on the trail of 2 Mohicans and a white hunter, for the officers can be considered as little better than idlers in such a scrimmage. Well, let him. Let him. There are always some honest men in every nation, though heaven knows, too, that they are scarce among the Maquas, to look down an upstart when he bragging again in the face of reason. The varlet sent his lead within a whistle of your ears, Sagamore." Chingachgook turned a calm and curious eye toward the place where the ball had struck, and then resumed his former attitude, with a composure that could not be disturbed by so trifling an incident. Just then Uncas glided into the circle, and seated himself at the fire, with the same appearance of indifference as was maintained by his father. Of these several moments Heyward was a deeply interested and wondering observer. It appeared to him as though the foresters had some secret means of intelligence, which had escaped the vigilance of his own faculties. In place of that eager and garrulous narration which a white youth would have endeavored to communicate, and perhaps exaggerate, that which had passed out in the darkness of the plain, the young warrior was seemingly content to let his deeds speak for themselves. It was, in fact, neither the moment nor the occasion for an Indian to boast of his exploits, and it is probably that, had Heyward neglected to inquire, not another syllable would just then have been uttered on the subject. "What has become of our enemy, Uncas?" demanded Duncan. "We heard your rifle, and hoped you had not fired in vain." The young chief removed a fold of his hunting skirt, and quietly exposed the fatal tuft of hair, which he bore as the symbol of victory. Chingachgook laid his hand on the scalp, and considered it for a moment with deep attention. Then, dropping it, with disgust depicted in his strong features, he ejaculated, "Oneida!" "Oneida!" repeated the scout, who was fast losing interest in the scene, in an apathy nearly assimilated to that of his red associate, but who now advanced in uncommon earnestness to regard the bloody badge. "By the Lord, if the Oneidas are outlying upon the trail, we shall be flanked by devils on every side of us. Now, to white eyes there is no difference between this bit of skin and that of any other Indian. Yet the Sagamore declares it came from the pole of the Mingo. Nay, he even names the tribe of the poor devil, with as much ease as if the scalp was a leaf of a book, and each hair a letter. What right have Christian whites to boast of their learning, when a savage can read a language that would prove too much for the wisest of all of them? What say you, lad? Of what people was the knave?" Uncas raised his eyes to face the scout, and answered in his soft voice, "Oneida." "Oneida again! When one Indian makes a declaration, it is commonly true, but when he is supported by his people, set it down as gospel." "The poor fellow has mistaken us for French," said Heyward, "or he would not have attempted the life of a friend." "He mistake a Mohican in his paint for a Huron? You would be as likely to mistake the white coat grenadiers of Montcalm for the scarlet red jackets of the Royal Americans," returned the scout. "No, no, the serpent knew his errand. Nor was there any great mistake in the matter, for there is little love between a Delaware and a Mingo, let their tribes go out and fight for whom they may, in a white quarrel. For that matter, though the Oneidas do serve his sacred majesty, who is my sovereign, lord and master, I should not have deliberated long about letting off the killdeer at the imp myself, had any luck thrown him in my way. That would have been an abuse of our treaties, and unworthy of your character." "When a man consorts with a people," continued Hawkeye, "if they were honest, and he no knave, love will grow up atwixt them. It is true that white cunning has managed to throw tribes into great confusion, as respect friends and enemies, so that the Hurons and the Oneidas, who speak the same tongue, or what may be called the same, take each other's scalps, and the Delaware are divided amongst themselves, with few hanging about their great council fires on their own river, and fighting on the same side with the Miningos, while the greater part are in the Canadas, out of natural enmity with the Maquas, thus throwing everything into disorder, and destroying all the harmony of warfare. Yet a red nature is not likely to alter with every shift of policy, so that the love atwixt the Mohican and the Mingo is much like the regard between a white man and a serpent. I regret to hear it, for I had believed those natives who dwelt within our boundaries have found us too just and liberal not to identify themselves fully in our quarrels. Why, I believe it's nature, to give preference to one's own quarrels before those of strangers. Now, for myself, I do love justice, and therefore I will not say I hate Mingoes, for that may be unsuitable to my color and my religion, though I will just repeat, it may have been owing to the night that Killdeer had no hand in the death of the sulking Oneida. Then, as if it satisfied with the force of his own reason, whatever might be their effect on the opinions of the other disputant, the honest but implacable woodsman turned from the fire, content to let the controversy slumber. Heyward withdrew to the rampart, too uneasy and too little accustomed to the warfare of the woods to remain at ease under the possibility of such insidious attack. Not so, however, with the scout and the Mohicans, those acute and long-practiced senses, whose powers so often exceeded the limits of all ordinary credulity, after having detected the danger, had enabled them to ascertain its magnitude and duration. Not one of the three appeared in the least to doubt their perfect security, as was indicated by the preparations that were soon made to sit in council over their future proceedings. The confusion of nations, and even of tribes, to which Hawkeye alluded, existed at that period in the fullest force. The great tie of language, and, of course, of common origin, was severed in many places, and it was one of its consequences that the Delaware and the Mingo, as the people of the Six Nations were called, were found fighting in the same ranks, while the latter sought the scalp of the Huron. Though believed to be the root of his own stock, the Delaware were even divided amongst themselves. Though love for the soil which had belonged to his ancestors kept Sagamore of the Mohicans with a small band of followers who were serving at Edward, under the banners of the English king. By far the largest portion of his nation were known to be in the field as allies of the Montcalm. The reader possibly knows, if enough has not already been gleaned from this narrative, that the Delaware, or Lenape, claimed to be the progenitors of that numerous people, who once were masters of the most of the eastern and northern states of America, of whom the community of the Mohicans was an ancient and highly honored member. It was, of course, with perfect understanding of the minute and intricate interests which had armed friend against friend, and brought natural enemies to combat by each other's side, that the scout and his companions now disposed themselves to deliberate on the measures that were to govern their future movements amid so many jarring and savage races of men. Duncan knew enough of Indian customs to understand the reason that the fire was replenished, and why the warriors, not excepting Hawkeye, took their seats within the curl of its smoke, with so much gravity and decorum, placing himself at an angle of the works, where he might be a spectator of the scene without. He awaited the results with as much patience as he could summon. After a short and impressive pause, Chingachgook lighted a pipe whose bowl was curiously carved in one of the soft stones of the country, whose stem was a tube of wood, and commenced smoking. When he had inhaled enough of the fragrance of the soothing weed, he passed the instrument into the hands of the scout. In this manner the pipe had made its rounds 3 several times, amid the most profound silence, before either of the party opened his lip. Then the Sagamore, as the oldest and highest in rank, in a few calm and dignified words, proposed the subject for deliberation. He was answered by the scout, and Chingachgook rejoined, when the others objected to his opinions. But the youthful Uncas continued a silent and respectful listener until Hawkeye, in complaisance, demanded his opinion. Heyward gathered from the manners of the different speakers that the father and son espoused one side of the disputed question, while the white man maintained the other. The contest gradually grew warmer, until it was quite evident the feelings of the speakers began to be somewhat enlisted in the debate. Notwithstanding the increasing warmth of the amicable contest, the most decorous Christian assembly, not even excepting those in which the reverend ministers are collected, might have learned a wholesome lesson of moderation from the forbearance and courtesy of the disputants. The words of Uncas were received with the same deep attention as those which fell from the mature wisdom of his father, and so far from manifesting any impatience, neither spoke in reply until a few moments of silent meditation were seemingly bestowed in deliberating on what had already been said. The language of the Mohicans was accompanied by gestures so direct and natural that Heyward had but little difficulty in following the thread of their argument. On the other hand, the scout was obscure, because from lingering pride of color he rather affected the cold and artificial manner which characterized all classes of Anglo-Americans when unexcited, by the frequency with which the Indians described the marks of the forest trail. It was evident they urged a pursuit by land, while the repeated sweep of Hawkeye's arms toward the Huron denoted that he was for passage across its waters. The latter was to every appearance fast losing ground, and the point was about to be decided against him, when he arose to his feet. Shaking off his apathy, he suddenly assumed the manner of an Indian, and adopted all the arts of native eloquence. Elevating an arm, he pointed out the track of the sun, repeating the gesture for every day that was necessary to accomplish their objects. Then he delineated a long and painful path amid rocks and watercourses. The age and weakness of the slumbering and unconscious Munro were indicated by signs too palatable to be mistaken. Duncan perceived that even his own powers were spoken lightly of, as the scout extended his palms and mentioned him by the appellation of the open hand, a name his liberality had purchased of all the friendly tribes. Then came a representation of the light and graceful movements of a canoe, set in forcible contrast to the trotting steps of one enfeebled and tired. He concluded by pointing to the scalp of the Oneida, and apparently urging the necessity of their departing speedily, and in a manner that should leave no trail. The Mohicans listened gravely, and with countenances that reflected the sentiments of the speaker. Conviction gradually wrought its influence. Towards the close of Hawkeye's speech, his sentences were accompanied by the customary exclamation of commendation. In short, Uncas and his father became converts to his way of thinking, abandoning their own previously expressed opinions with a liberality and candor that, they had been the representatives of some great and civilized people, would have infallibly worked their political ruin by destroying forever their reputations for consistency. The instant the matter in discussion was decided, the debate, and everything connected with it, except the result, appeared to be forgotten. Hawkeye, without looking round to read his triumph in applauding eyes, very composedly stretched his tall frame before the dying embers, and closed his own organs in sleep. Left now, in a measure, to themselves, the Mohicans, whose time had been so much devoted to the interests of others, seized the moment to devote some attention to themselves. Casting off at once the grave and austere demeanor of an Indian chief, Chingachgook commenced speaking to his son in the soft and playful tones of affection. Uncas gladly met the familiar air of his father, and before the hard breathing of the scout announced that he slept, a complete change was effected in the manner of the two associates. It is impossible to describe the music of their language, while thus engaged in laughter and endearments, in such a way as to render it intelligible to those whose ears have never listened to its melody. The compass of their voice, particularly that of the youth, was wonderful, extending from the deepest bass tones that were feminine in softness. The eyes of the father followed the plastic and ingenious movements of the son with open delight. He never failed to smile in reply to the other's contagious but low laughter, while under the influence of these gentle and natural feelings, no trace of ferocity was to be seen in the softened features of the Sagamore. His figured panoply of death looked more like a disguise assumed in mockery than a fierce annunciation of a desire to carry destruction in his footsteps. After an hour had passed, in the indulgence of their better feelings, Chingachgook abruptly announced his desire to sleep by wrapping his head in his blanket and stretching his form on the naked earth. The merriment of Uncas instantly ceased, and carefully raking the coals in such a manner that they should impart their warmth to his father's feet, the youth sought his own pillow among the ruins of the place. Imbibing renewed confidence from the security of these experienced foresters, Heyward soon imitated their example, and long before the night had turned, they who lay in the bosom of the ruined work seemed to slumber as heavily as the unconscious multitude whose bones were already beginning to bleach on the surrounding plain. End of chapter 19.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eric Wisdahl, Gainesville, Florida. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 20.
Land of Albania, let me bend mine eyes on thee, thou rugged nurse of savage men. Childe Harold.
The heavens were still studded with stars when Hawkeye came to arouse the sleepers. Casting aside their cloaks, Monroe and Hayward were on their feet while the woodsman was still making his low calls at the entrance of the rude shelter where they had passed the night. When they issued from beneath its concealment, they found the scout awaiting their appearance nigh by, and the only salutation between them was the significant gesture for silence made by their sagacious leader.
"Think over your prayers,"
he whispered, as they approached him.
"For he to whom you make them knows all tongues, that of the heart as well as those of the mouth. But speak not a syllable. It is rare for a white voice to pitch itself properly in the woods, as we have seen by the example of that miserable devil, the singer. Come,"
he continued, turning towards a curtain of the works.
"Let us get into the ditch on this side, and be regardful to step on the stones and fragments of wood as you go."
His companions complied, though to two of them the reasons of this extraordinary precaution were yet a mystery. When they were in the low cavity that surrounded the earthen fort on three sides, they found that passage nearly choked by the ruins. With care and patience, however, they succeeded in clambering after the scout, until they reached the sandy shore of the Huron.
"That's a trail that nothing but a nose can follow,"
said the satisfied scout, looking back along their difficult way.
"Grass is a treacherous carpet for a flying party to tread on, but wood and stone take no print from a moccasin. Had you worn your armed boots, there might, indeed, have been something to fear, but with the deerskin suitably prepared, a man may trust himself, generally, on rocks with safety. Shove in the canoe nigher to the land, Uncas. The sand will take a stamp as easily as the butter of the Germans on the Mohawk. Softly, lad, softly. It must not touch the beach, or the knaves will know by what road we have left the place."
The young man observed the precaution, and the scout, laying a board from the ruins to the canoe, made a sign for the two officers to enter. When this was done, everything was studiously restored to its former disorder, and then Hawkeye succeeded in reaching his little birchen vessel without leaving behind him any of those marks which he appeared so much to dread. Hayward was silent until the Indians had cautiously paddled the canoe some distance from the fort, and within the broad and dark shadows that fell from the eastern mountain on the glassy surface of the lake. Then he demanded, "What need have we for this stolen and hurried departure?" "If the blood of the Oneida could stain such a sheet of pure water as this we float on," returned the scout, "your two eyes would answer your own question. Have you forgotten the skulking reptile Uncas slew?" "By no means, but he was said to be alone, and dead men give no cause for fear." "Ay, he was alone in his deviltry, but an Indian whose tribe counts so many warriors need seldom fear his blood will run without the death shriek coming speedily from some of his enemies." "But our presence, the authority of Colonel Monroe, would prove sufficient protection against the anger of our allies, especially in a case where the wretch so well merited his fate. I trust in heaven you have not deviated a single foot from the direct line of our course with so slight a reason." "Do you think that the bullet of the varlet's rifle would have turned aside, though his sacred majesty the king had stood in its path?" returned the stubborn scout. "Why did not the grand Frencher, he who is captain general of the Canadas, bury the tomahawks of the Hurons if a word from a white can work so strongly on the nature of an Indian?" The reply of Hayward was interrupted by a groan from Monroe, but after he had paused a moment, in deference to the sorrow of his aged friend, he resumed the subject. "The Marquis of Montcalm can only settle that error with his God," said the young man solemnly.
Now this is reason in your words, for they are bottomed on religion and honesty. There's a vast difference between throwing a regiment of white coats atwixt the tribes and the prisoners, and coaxing an angry savage to forget he carries a knife and rifle, with words that must begin with calling him your son. No, no, continued the scout, looking back at the dim shore of William Henry, which was now fast receding, and laughing in his own silent but heartfelt manner. I have put a trail of water atween us, and unless the imps can make friends with the fishes, and hear who has paddled across their basin this fine morning, we shall throw the length of the Horican behind us before they have made up their minds which path to take.
With foes in front, and foes in our rear, our journey is like to be one of danger.
Danger, repeated Hawkeye, calmly. No, not absolute of danger, for with vigilant ears and quick eyes, we can manage to keep a few hours ahead of the knaves, or, if we must try the rifle, there are 3 of us who understand its gifts as well as any you can name on the borders. No, not of danger, but that we shall have what you call a brisk push of it is probable, and it may happen a brush, a scrimmage, or some such diversion, but always where covers are good and ammunition abundant.
It is possible that Hayward's estimate of danger differed in some degree from that of the scout, for, instead of replying, he now sat in silence, while the canoe glided over several miles of water. Just as the day dawned, they entered the narrows of the lake, and stole swiftly and cautiously among their numberless little islands. It was by this road that Montcalm had retired with his army, and the adventurers knew not but he had left some of his Indians in ambush to protect the rear of his forces and collect the stragglers. They, therefore, approached the passage with the customary silence of their guarded habits.
Footnote: the beauties of Lake George are well known to every American tourist. In the height of the mountains in which surround it, and in artificial accessories, it is inferior to the finest of the Swiss and Italian lakes, while in outline and purity of water it is fully their equal, and in the number and disposition of its isles and islets much superior to them altogether. There is said to be some hundreds of islands in a sheet of water less than 30 miles long. The narrows, which connect what may be called in truth 2 lakes, are crowded with islands to such a degree as to leave passages between them frequently of only a few feet in width. The lake itself varies in breadth from 1 to 3 miles. End footnote.
Chingachgook laid aside his paddle, while Uncas and the scout urged the light vessel through crooked and intricate canals, where every foot that they advanced exposed them to the danger of some sudden rising on their progress. The eyes of the Sagamore moved warily from islet to islet, and copse to copse as the canoe proceeded, and when a clear sheet of water permitted, his keen vision was bent along the bald rocks and impending forests that frowned upon the narrow strait. Hayward, who was a doubly interested spectator, as well from the beauties of the place as from the apprehension natural to the situation, was just believing that he had permitted the latter to be excited without sufficient reason, when the paddle ceased moving, in obedience to a signal from Chingachgook.
"Huh!"
exclaimed Uncas, nearly at the moment that the light tap his father had made on the side of the canoe notified them of the vicinity of danger.
"What now?"
asked the scout.
"The lake is as smooth as if the winds had never blown, and I can see along its sheet for miles. There is not so much as the black head of a loon dotting the water."
The Indian gravely raised his paddle, and pointed in the direction in which his own steady look was riveted. Duncan's eyes followed the motion. A few rods in their front lay another of the wooded islets, but it appeared as calm and peaceful as if its solitude had never been disturbed by the foot of man. "I see nothing," he said, "but land and water, and lovely scene it is."
"Hist!"
interrupted the scout.
Sagamore, there is always a reason for what you do. 'Tis but a shade, and yet it is not natural. You see the mist, Major, that is rising above the island. You can't call it a fog, for it is more like a streak of thin cloud.
"It is a vapor from the water."
That a child could tell. But what is the edging of blacker smoke that hangs along its lower side, and which you may trace down into the thicket of hazel? 'Tis from a fire, but one that, in my judgment, has been suffered to burn low.
Let us, then, push for that place, and relieve our doubts, said the impatient Duncan. The party must be small that can lie in such a bit of land.
If you judge of Indian cunning by the rules you find in books, or by white sagacity, they will lead you astray, if not to your death, returned Hawkeye, examining the signs of the place with that acuteness which distinguished him. If I may be permitted to speak in this manner, it will be to say that we have but two things to choose between. The one is, to return and give up all thoughts of following the Hurons.
Never! exclaimed Heyward, in a voice far too loud for their circumstances.
Well, well,
continued Hawkeye, making a hasty sign to repress his impatience.
I am much of your mind myself, though I thought it becoming to my experience to tell the whole. We must, then, make a push, and if the Indians or Frenchers are in the Narrows, run the gauntlet through these toppling mountains. Is there reason in my woods, Sagamore?
The Indian made no other answer than by dropping his paddle into the water, and urging forward the canoe. As he held the office of directing its course, his resolution was sufficiently indicated by the movement. The whole party now plied their paddles vigorously, and in a very few moments they had reached a point whence they might command an entire view of the northern shore of the island, the side that had hitherto been concealed.
There they are, by all the truth of signs,
whispered the scout.
2 canoes in the smoke. The knaves haven't yet got their eyes out of the mist, or we should hear the accursed whoop. Together, friends, we are leaving them, and are already nearly out of whistle of a bullet.
The well-known crack of a rifle, whose ball came skipping along the placid surface of the strait, and a shrill yell from the island interrupted his speech and announced that their passage was discovered. In another instant several savages were seen rushing into canoes, which were soon dancing over the water in pursuit. These fearful precursors of a coming struggle produced no change in the countenances and movements of his 3 guides, so far as Duncan could discover, except that the strokes of their paddle were longer and more in unison, and caused the little bark to spring forward like a creature possessing life and volition.
"Hold them there, Sagamore,"
said Hawkeye, looking coolly backward over his left shoulder, while he still plied his paddle.
"Keep them just there. Them Hurons have never a piece in their nation that will execute at this distance, but Killdeer has a barrel on which a man may calculate."
The scout, having ascertained that the Mohicans were sufficient of themselves to maintain the requisite distance, deliberately laid aside his paddle, and raised the fatal rifle. 3 several times he brought the piece to his shoulder, and when his companions were expecting its report, he as often lowered it to request the Indians would permit their enemies to approach a little nigher. At length his accurate and fastidious eye seemed satisfied, and, throwing out his left arm on the barrel, he was slowly elevating the muzzle, when an exclamation from Uncas, who sat at the bow, once more caused him to suspend the shot.
"What now, lad?" demanded Hawkeye. "You save a Huron from the death shriek by that word. Have you reason for what you do?"
Uncas pointed towards a rocky shore a little in their front, whence another war canoe was darting directly across their course. It was too obvious now that their situation was eminently perilous to need the aid of language to confirm it. The scout laid aside his rifle and resumed the paddle, while Chingachgook inclined the bows of the canoe a little towards the western shore, in order to increase the distance between them and this new enemy. In the meantime they were reminded of the presence of those who pressed upon their rear by wild and exhalating shouts. The stirring scene awakened even Munro from his apathy. "Let us make for the rocks on the main," he said, with the mien of a tired soldier, "and give battle to the savages. God forbid that I, or those attached to me and mine, should ever trust again to the faith of any servant of Louis.
Who wishes to prosper in Indian warfare," returned the scout, "must not be too proud to learn from the wit of a native. Lay her more along the land, Sagamore. We are doubling on the varlets, and perhaps they may try to strike our trail on the long calculation."
Hawkeye was not mistaken, for when the Hurons found their course was likely to throw them behind their chase, they rendered it less direct, until, by gradually bearing more and more obliquely, the two canoes were, ere long, gliding on parallel lines within 200 yards of each other. It now became entirely a trial of speed. So rapid was the progress of the light vessels, that the lake curled in their front in miniature waves, and their motion became undulating by its own velocity. It was, perhaps, owing to this circumstance, in addition to the necessity of keeping every hand employed at the paddles, that the Hurons had not immediate recourse to their firearms. The exertions of the fugitives were too severe to continue long, and the pursuers had the advantage of numbers. Duncan observed with uneasiness that the scout began to look anxiously about him, as if searching for some further means of assisting their flight.
"Edge her a little more from the sun, Sagamore," said the stubborn woodsman. "I see the knaves are sparing a man to the rifle. A single broken bone might lose us our scalps. Edge more from the sun, and we will put the islands between us."
The expedient was not without its use. A long, low island lay at a little distance before them, and, as they closed with it, the chasing canoe was compelled to take a side opposite to that on which the pursued passed. The scout and his companions did not neglect this advantage, but the instant they were hid from observation by the bushes, they redoubled efforts that before had seemed prodigious. The two canoes came round the last low point, like two coursers at the top of their speed, the fugitives taking the lead. This change had brought them nigher to each other, however, while it altered their relative positions.
"You showed knowledge in the shaping of a birchen bark, Uncas, when you chose this from among the Huron canoes," said the scout, smiling, apparently more in satisfaction at their superiority in the race than from the prospect of final escape, which now began to open a little upon them. "The imps have put all their strength again at the paddles, and we are to struggle from our scalps with bits of flattened wood instead of clouded barrels and true eyes. A long stroke, and together, friends."
"They are preparing for a shot," said Heyward, "and as we are in a line with them, it can scarcely fail."
"Get you, then, into the bottom of the canoe," returned the scout. "You and the colonel. It will be so much taken from the size of the mark."
Heyward smiled as he answered, "It would be but an ill example for the highest in rank to dodge while the warriors were under fire."
"Lord, Lord, that is now a white man's courage," exclaimed the scout, "and like to many of his notions, not to be maintained by reason. Do you think that Sagamore, or Uncas, or even I, who am a man without a cross, would deliberate upon finding a cover in the scrimmage, when an open body would do no good? For what have the Frenchers reared up there at Quebec, if fighting is always to be done in the clearings?"
"All that you say is very true, my friend," replied Heyward. "Still, our customs must prevent us from doing as you wish." A volley from the Hurons interrupted the discourse, and as the bullets whistled about them, Duncan saw the head of Uncas turned, looking back at himself and Munro. Notwithstanding the nearness of the enemy, and his own great personal danger, the countenance of the young warrior expressed no other emotion, as the former was compelled to think, than amazement at finding men willing to encounter so useless an exposure. Chingachgook was probably better acquainted with the notions of white men, for he did not even cast a glance aside from the riveted look his eye maintained on the object by which he governed their course. A ball soon struck the light and polished paddle from the hands of the chief, and drove it through the air far in their advance. A shout arose from the Hurons, who seized the opportunity to fire another volley. Uncas described an arc in the water with his own blade, and as the canoe passed swiftly on, Chingachgook recovered his paddle, and flourishing it on high, he gave the war-whoop of the Mohicans, and then lent his strength and skill again to the important task. The clamorous sounds of "Le Gros Serpent," "Le Lunga Carabine," "Le Kerf Agile," burst at once from the canoes behind, and it seemed to give new zeal to the pursuers. The scout seized Killdeer in his left hand, and, elevating it about his head, he shook it in triumph at his enemies. The savages answered the insult with a yell, and immediately another volley succeeded. The bullets pattered along the lake, and one even pierced the bark of their little vessel. No perceptible emotion could be discovered in the Mohicans during this critical moment, their rigid features expressing neither hope nor alarm. But the scout again turned his head, and, laughing in his own silent manner, he said to Heyward,
"The knaves love to hear the sounds of their pieces, but the eye is not to be found among the Mingoes that can calculate a true range in a dancing canoe. You see the dumb devils have taken off a man to charge, and by the smallest measurement that can be allowed, we move 3 feet to their 2.
Duncan, who was not altogether as easy under this nice estimate of distances as his companions, was glad to find, however, that, owing to their superior dexterity and the diversion among their enemies, they were very sensibly obtaining the advantage. The Huron soon fired again, and a bullet struck the blade of Hawkeye's paddle without injury.
"That will do,"
said the scout, examining the slight indentation with a curious eye.
"It would not have cut the skin of an infant, much less of men, who, like us, have been blown upon by the heavens in their anger. Now, Major, if you will try to use this piece of flattened wood, I'll let Killdeer take a part in this conversation."
Heyward seized the paddle, and applied himself to the work with an eagerness that supplied the place of skill, while Hawkeye was engaged in inspecting the priming of his rifle. The latter then took a swift aim and fired. The Huron in the bows of the leading canoe had risen with a similar object, and he now fell backward, suffering his gun to escape from his hands into the water. In an instant, however, he recovered his feet, though his gestures were wild and bewildered. At the same moment his companions suspended their efforts, and the chasing canoes clustered together and became stationary. Chingachgook and Uncas profited by the interval to regain their wind, though Duncan continued to work with the most persevering industry. The father and son now cast calm but inquiring glances at each other, to learn if either had sustained any injury by the fire, for both well knew that no cry or explanation would, in such a moment of necessity, have been permitted to betray the accident. A few large drops of blood were trickling down the shoulder of the Sagamore, who, when he perceived that the eyes of Uncas dwelt too long on the sight, raised some water into the hollow of his hand, and washing off the stain, was content to manifest, in this simple manner, the slightness of the injury.
"Softly, softly, Major,"
said the scout, who by this time had reloaded his rifle.
"We are a little too far ahead for a rifle to put forth its beauties, and you see yonder imps are holding a council. Let them come up within striking distance. My eye may well be trusted in such a manner, and I will trail the varlets the length of the Hawkeye, guaranteeing that not a shot of theirs shall, at worst, more than break the skin, while Killdeer shall touch the life twice and 3 times."
"We forget our errand," returned the diligent Duncan. "For God's sake, let us profit by this advantage, and increase our distance from the enemy."
"Give me my children," said Munro, hoarsely. "Trifle no longer with a father's agony, but restore me my babes."
Long and habitual deference to the mandates of his superiors had taught the scout the virtue of obedience. Throwing a last and lingering glance at the distant canoes, he laid aside his rifle, and, relieving the wearied Duncan, resumed the paddle, which he wielded with sinews that never tired. His efforts were seconded by those of the Mohicans, and a very few minutes served to place such a sheet of water between them and their enemies, that Heyward once more breathed freely. The lake now began to expand, and the route lay along a wide reach that was lined, as before, by high and ragged mountains. But the islands were few and easily avoided. The strokes of the paddles grew more measured and regular, while they who plied them continued their labor, after the close and deadly chase from which they had just relieved themselves, with as much coolness as though their speed had been tried in sport, rather than under such pressing, nay, almost desperate, circumstances. Instead of following the western shore, whither their errand led them, the wary Mohican inclined his course more towards those hills behind which Montcalm was known to have led his army into the formidable fortress of Ticonderoga. As the Hurons, to every appearance, had abandoned the pursuit, there was no apparent reason for this excess of caution. It was, however, maintained for hours, until they had reached a bay, nigh the northern termination of the lake. Here the canoe was driven upon the beach, and the whole party landed. Hawkeye and Heyward ascended an adjacent bluff, where the former, after considering the expanse of water beneath him, pointed out to the latter a small black object, hovering under a headland at the distance of several miles.
"Do you see it?"
demanded the scout.
"Now, what would you account that spot, were you left alone to white experience to find your way through this wilderness?"
But for its distance and its magnitude, I should suppose it a bird. Can it be a living object?"
"'Tis a canoe of good birchen bark, and paddled by fierce and crafty Mingoes. Though Providence has lent to those who inhabit the woods eyes that would be needless to men in the settlements, where there are inventions to assist the sight, yet no human organs can see all the dangers which at this moment circumvent us. These varlets pretend to be bent chiefly on their sundown meal, but the moment it is dark they will be on our trail, as true as hounds on the scent. We must throw them off, or our pursuit of Le Renard Sautel may be given up. These lakes are useful at times, especially when the game take the water," continued the scout, gazing about him with a countenance of concern. "But they give no cover, except it be to the fishes. God knows what the country will be, if the settlements should ever spread far from the two rivers. Both hunting and war would lose their beauty."
Let us not delay a moment, without some good and obvious cause.
"I little like that smoke, which you may see warming up along the rock above the canoe,"
interrupted the abstracted scout.
"My life on it, other eyes than ours see it and know its meaning. Well, words will not mend the matter, and it is time that we were doing."
Hawkeye moved away from the lookout, and descended musingly, profoundly, to the shore. He communicated the result of his observation to his companions, in Delaware, and a short and earnest consultation succeeded. When it terminated, the three instantly set about executing their new resolutions. The canoe was lifted from the water and borne on the shoulders of the party. They proceeded into the wood, making as broad and obvious a trail as possible. They soon reached the watercourse, which they crossed, and, continuing onward until they came to an extensive and naked rock. At this point, where their footsteps might be expected to be no longer visible, they retraced their route to the brook, walking backwards with the utmost care. They now followed the bed of the little stream to the lake, into which they immediately launched their canoe again. A low point concealed them from the headland, and the margin of the lake was fringed from some distance with dense and overhanging bushes. Under the cover of these natural advantages they toiled their way, with patient industry, until the scout pronounced that he believed it would be safe once more to land. The halt continued until evening rendered objects indistinct and uncertain to the eye. Then they resumed their route, and, favored by the darkness, pushed silently and vigorously toward the western shore. Although the rugged outline of mountain to which they were steering presented no distinctive marks to the eyes of Duncan, the Mohicans entered the little haven he had selected with the confidence and accuracy of an experienced pilot. The boat was again lifted and borne into the woods, where it was carefully concealed under a pile of brush. The adventurers assumed their arms and packs, and the scout announced to Munro and Heyward that he and the Indians were at last in readiness